So it's my pleasure to introduce and moderate the event here today. My hope is that today's discussion can contribute to advancing the alignment of thematic bond instrument with the SDGs. This is indeed very much needed, and there is great potential for this. The financing gap to reach the SDGs amount to a staggering $4.2 trillion per year. In many ways, we are in the middle of a crisis for development, where flows to developing countries are showing a negative trend. The good news is that investors show interest in developing countries and emerging markets. However, at the same time, they point out that there is a lack of easy access through instruments allowing for standardized investments at scale. And there is a lack of investable pipelines. SDG sovereign bonds represent an effective way to catalyze large financial flow for public finance, such as for a country's investments needs in health, education, biodiversity, and climate alignment. Some of these areas, biodiversity, for example, has been relatively difficult to attract private sector investments to. With SDG sovereign bonds, countries can enable investments in many areas at the same time via one single instrument. SIDA Sweden is working closely with investors through the Swedish Investors for Sustainable Development and the Global Investors for Sustainable Development, GISD. GISD is an alliance led by the Secretary General of the United Nations with participation of over 30 large investors, many of them institutional investors. The GISD Alliance has recommended countries to issue SDG sovereign bonds when in issuing sovereign bonds, or to issue, SDG sovereign bonds. At the same time, countries have embarked INFFs in order to more effectively and holistically address financing for sustainable development on country level. There is an increasing ambition to access the international financial markets, often articulated in countries' INFFs. It can be noted that this region, Asia and the Pacific, has been particularly interested in thematic debt being taken forward through INFFs. About a year and a half ago, SIDA, together with UNDESA and UNDP, gathered countries, GISD investors, and the World Bank in a closed roundtable discussion of common interest. Some follow-up discussions have been held, the latest at a side event at Financing for Development Forum in New York in April this year. At the forum, investors within the GISD Alliance launched an initiative and work stream aimed at enhancing the integrity and quality of sovereign bond issuance and aligned to the Sustainable Development Goals. The GISD announcement was accompanied by a call for collaboration for public and private sector actors to join the consultations as part of a new work stream. As part of the initiative, the GISD Alliance will develop guidelines to enable governments and investors to navigate the expanding and often complex universe of SDG-linked sovereign bonds. We see that well and cautiously designed SDG sovereign bonds can release assets for where they are needed the most and for sustainable development. We see the potential for countries to finance also social SDGs in addition to the green SDGs. Working on SDG sovereign bonds should be a responsible process, of course, and not stretch already stretched debt levels in countries. Yet we need to seek to scale long-term investing for the SDGs and for the future we all want. And debt reconstruction can be included in the SDG bonds. From SIDA, we also see that working with SDG bonds can bring out transparency and understanding around countries' debt situations. And we do see a clear need for reporting frameworks, accountability of where funds raised are invested. I'm sure there are thoughts about this in the room and that we can discuss this further during the afternoon. From SIDA, we also conclude that the SDG sovereign bonds that have come to market so far have done that without incentives or guarantees. However, SIDA has a guarantee instrument, and we have started to explore how this guarantee instrument can be used related to sovereign debt and debt of state-owned companies. It is also used in the collaboration we have with IIX, and we will later hear about that around the orange bonds. There is also a need for a broader dialogue with guarantee providers, initially including the MDBs, which often hold guarantee instruments. So, with this introduction, I want to introduce the panelists that we have here today. And I'm very pleased to have a very interesting group of panelists and distinguished panelists with a great wealth of knowledge on the issues we are about to discuss. So first, may I ask Mr. Denny Ridwan to come to the floor. Mr. Ridwan has over 25 years of professional public policy experience in the financial services sector, focusing on banking and insurance. He now manages the Indonesian Ministry of Finance major budgeting financing instrument, government debt securities. And then he oversees the management of government bonds, which includes the formulation of government bond policies, the execution of government bond transactions, the development and deepening of the government bond market, and the innovation of government debt securities instrument, and so forth.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So, for the next panelist, may I introduce Mr. Vacharin Sirimanitham. Mr. Vacharin is Chief of Macroeconomic Policy and Analysis at the UNESCAP. And since joining in 2012, he has been part of the team that produces Economic and Social Survey of Asia and the Pacific, which is ESCAP's flagship report. His recent research focus on SDG finance and public debt sustainability, inclusive and green central banking, and macroeconomic modeling for sustainable development. Welcome. And may I now introduce Mr. Mohammad Humer Karim. Mr. Mohammad Humer Karim has 30 years of experience spanning international organizations, the civil service of Pakistan, and the private sector. He has held positions at federal, provincial, and field levels, dealing with planning, economic development, foreign assistance, institutional reforms, monitoring and evaluation, and public grievance redress. He's presently serving as Additional Secretary at Ministry of Economics Affairs at the Government of Pakistan. Warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
And last but not least, Ms. Natasha Garcha, who is Senior Director of Innovative Finance at Impact Investment Exchange, IIX, where she has worked on IIX Gender Lens, investing initiatives and impact measurement work in Asia-Pacific, East Africa, and the United States. Natasha's team focuses on the restructuring, investor relations, and impact assessment for IIX award-winning Women's Livelihood Bond TM series that is empowering over 1 million women in the global south to build economic security and climate resilience. And Natasha is joining us via link from Singapore, I believe. Welcome, Natasha.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being here. Very nice to see you, Anna Maria.
So, let me start by asking you, Demi. The green social sustainability and sustainability linked, or the thematic bond market in Asia-Pacific, has been growing rapidly in recent years. In 2022, the market saw a total issuance of $86 billion US dollars, up from 60 billion in 2021. Indonesia has been at the forefront of the innovation of this market, having raised over $8 billion US dollars of thematic bonds in international and domestic market. Indonesia has also issued the world's first green sukuk in 2018, as SDG bond in 2021, and most recently a blue bond in 2023. Quite impressive. So based on your experiences, what have been the advantages, challenges, and lessons learned from the thematic bond issuance compared to conventional debt issuances?
Thank you, Anna, for having us to share our experience, our challenging but rewarding experience in developing our thematic bonds. So from our experience, the main advantage of issuing thematic bonds, among others, is to enhance synergy and collective effort by various parties to achieve the SDG target, as well as climate change adaptation and mitigation efforts. So by participating in the process of thematic bonds issuance, line ministries, regional governments have a better understanding about their roles and responsibility in achieving the SDG targets. And through our platform, in this case, our impact report, we also provide a platform to recognize and also to appreciate their contributions. And I think in the first, in the morning session, it's already mentioned as well that in achieving sustainable development target, the financing is a key main drivers. And from us, from the Ministry of Finance perspective, the challenge is how to optimize our limited fiscal space and also our limited fiscal policy options in order to support the developments, sustainable developments. And when we talk about state budget, it consists of three elements, right? The revenue side, the spending, and also the financings. So, for example, on the revenue side, how the government can provide incentive to promote more sustainable and more environment-friendly sectors. On the spending side, we also try to prioritize spending on services and goods that related with the climate change adaptation and mitigation efforts. And to do so, since 2014 and 15, we started, next slide please. We started our effort, a program, we call it the climate budget tagging programs, in order to identify government projects, that can be classified as projects that support the climate change adaptation and mitigation effort. And since 2016, we can fully implement our climate budget tagging system in our budget. Then we can identify spendings on this area from central government and also the regional governments. And since 2017, then we provide to try to develop a new instruments. In this case, we decided to issue the green sukuk first. Why? Because the Islamic financing principle actually in line with the green principles. As maybe you already are aware as well that for issuing a sukuk or Islamic finance instrument, it required underlying projects. So what we have done is replacing the existing underlying projects with the eligible green projects. So it's quite pragmatic and strategic approach. And at the same time, we also develop our frameworks, and I were lucky that we support by the UNDP from the beginning. We provide the frameworks in order to make sure that our sukuk is in line with the international standards. And the framework was also reviewed by Cicero, and it get the medium green shades. So after the finalization of the frameworks and also from the review by the SPO in 2018, after 3 years of preparation, we issue our first green global sukuks, and we have quite encouraging feedback from investors. And since then, as you mentioned, we have regularly issue green bonds in the global market, and so far we have issued more than $5 billion US dollars. And using the existing frameworks in 2019, we also issue green retail sukuks. So we're tapping the market. We provide investing instrument for retail investor through our online platform, and also becoming the first in the world. We are issuing retail investor with the green instruments, and up to now we have issued retail green sukuk, and the total is around 25 trillion rupiah. And then, following the success of green sukuk issuance in 2021, we try to upgrade our frameworks, not only focus on the green, but also incorporated our focus on blue economy and also for the social projects. So that's why in 2021, we upgrade our framework, becoming the Republic of Indonesia SDG Government Security Framework, or SDG frameworks. And then this framework also reviewed by second party opinion, in this case Cicero and IISD, and based on the review, our framework is in line with the green bond principle, social bond principle, and also sustainability bonds guidelines. And after that, we issue our first SDG bonds in 2021, the amount around 500 million euro with the tenor 12 years. Is becoming our recorded as the first Asian sovereign issue SDG bonds in euro currency. And last year, 2022, we also offer the thematic bonds in the domestic market through auctions. So based on our experience, next slide, there are a couple of lessons learned. First, is it important for us to have commitment from all parties involved, and compared to plain vanilla bonds, thematic bonds require efforts from the preparing frameworks until preparing the impact report. And the last one, I think we need to make sure that we get pricing benefit. But so far, after we issue green bond, blue bond, SDG bonds, we haven't seen any significant pricing benefit. So we encourage the private sector to appreciate our effort by providing more pricing benefit. I stop here.
So thank you very much, Danny. This was indeed impressive, and you've been in the market for a long time. And while some countries in the region, like Indonesia, are well placed to reap the benefits of green, social, and sustainability bond markets, more and more developing countries in Asia-Pacific are struggling under mounting public debt, making it difficult for them to invest in sustainable development. And in your recent publication, Vacharin, the Economic and Social Survey for the Asia-Pacific, Rethinking Public Debt for SDG, you are arguing for moving away from the conventional view that a higher public debt is necessarily bad for economic growth and stability, and that there is a common optimal debt level applicable to all countries, even though they may be in different circumstances. So can you elaborate a bit more on this, please?
Yes, sure. Thank you. I have some slides to show, but I can start If you look at the public debt to GDP ratio of the whole developing Asia-Pacific economy, and we see that it has reached the 18-year high in 2021. Okay, the chart shows you that actually the upward trend has been observed around since 2008 onwards, which is coincide with the global financial crisis, especially in developed economy. In that, as a result of that, as a quantitative easing or QE has led to the unusually low interest rate, which developing economy in the region tend to benefit, so they borrow more. Okay. Another chart, which we look going forward into the forecast, the shaded area, you see that the mean and median start to diverge, which simply mean that in the next few years, public debt level in some country will be much higher than other economy. And we did some decomposition. When we say public debt is higher, we answer why. Okay, and the answer is mainly because of the sizable fiscal deficit. Okay, which means revenue is fall short of the spending. Okay, and another part is currency depreciation in many economy as well. And the bad news is that we will look at the chart on the green part. In the past, the region has, as a whole, has benefited from the robust economic growth. At the same time, that the interest rate has been unusually low. Okay, but we see that this trend is going to be reversed in the next coming years. So it's not a good news anymore. And the next chart show you some current thinking and what we would like to put as a relatively newer thinking. Okay. The first one is that when we look at the word debt, okay, whether it is a personal debt, household debt, even the sovereign debt, it conveys a bad meaning, okay, and necessarily so because of the way that the international financial institution has been approaching this topic. So the next slide, please. And so we are doing that. It depends, just like a corporate. Some corporate they grow very fast. At the same time that they accumulate a lot of debt. It's depending on how you use this borrowing. And SCAP stand is that we tend to use this. If the country uses this judiciously with a long-term horizon, then public debt by itself may not be a problem, depending on how you use it. The second point is that if I can have the next slide, please. And if the point, the next one is that there seems to be the so-called optimum public debt level in the literature, and also used by IMF and the World Bank. Let's say that if the public debt in your country exceeds 60% of GDP, it's considered that you are in deep trouble. You are having a high public debt of distress. But we are arguing that this should be really country-specific, just like a person. You need to consider spending need for achieve the SDG of each country, and also the development deficit of the country. So if the country is fall far behind of the SDG, naturally they want to have more debt to fulfill the SDG, and probably not the case that they have a higher risk of public debt distress. And the last point is, as you may know, DSA, Public Debt Sustainability Analysis, used by the IMF World Bank, is usually a short-term horizon, 3 to 5 years. And it takes into account a country national plan, a bit of the assumption on the economic growth and interest rate. And if you exceed certain threshold, then it's considered that you are in the high risk of debt distress. And we are saying that because of the UN mandate, SDG, and all of that, we are asking to supplement this methodology with a longer-term approach, which we propose a new supplementary methodology, not to replace the current methodology. And which the next slide, please. And so this what we call augmented public debt sustainability analysis essentially is really straightforward. It has 4 components. The first one, we take into account what is the SDG spending need in each country. The second one, how the country going to finance this, what we call SDG national financing strategy, as well as the non-monetary structural development policy. For example, when the government changed the law, this is not about investment, but it also brings some long-term benefit. and a couple with some stress test. And we implement this new methodology in the case of Mongolia, in which the result is on the next slide. So in the case of Mongolia, our policy, we assume that there's a package of policy to introduce Mongolia into a more inclusive and also in a greener, more diversified economy. Okay, we assume certain financing strategy as well as the spending need to achieve the SDG, which is a big amount. Basically, additional is about 17% of GDP per year, every year until 2030, which is a lot more. Okay, and the chart show you the dotted one is the baseline scenario, which we more or less took it from the IMF estimate, and we extrapolate that. And the solid line is the result from our modeling analysis. You see that it's really intuitive. As you would expect, public debt would initially increase because of the large SDG spending need. But once people take into account the benefit of investing in the SDG, whether in terms of the labor productivity, better healthcare, and lower shock from the climate loss, all of this contributing to the higher output level, which in the long run, by 2040, and then the public debt will convert back to the baseline scenario. But the key difference is that the benefit of the people and the environment will be much greater by 2040, roughly, by our estimate. Thank you.
Thank you, Vacharan. I really picked up on the fact that how you use the debt is really the key. So, and that public debt is a powerful tool for development and for achieving the sustainable development goals if they are used appropriately and with a long-term perspective. So thank you for that. And now I turn to Humar from the government of Pakistan. So continuing on the topic of debt, debt distress, and zooming in on Pakistan. Pakistan is facing a twin crisis of climate vulnerability and debt distress. According to the UNDP study, 52 low and middle income countries, or 52 low and middle income countries are already or at risk of being in debt distress. So what is a country's strategy on pursuing development objectives while managing the debt crisis?
May I stand and make a presentation? Please do. All right, I'll just stand here. Hello. Okay. Yes. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Humar Karim. I'm Additional Secretary, Ministry of Economic Affairs, and I'm representing the Pakistan delegation here. So, can you hear me? No. Hello? You can hear me? All right, okay. So I'm representing the Pakistan delegation here, and it's a pleasure and honor to be here. I'd like to thank the organizers. It gives me a good opportunity to present or give an overview of Pakistan's case. Now, the topic assigned to me was innovative financing in the era of high debt levels, the case for Pakistan. Now, when I talk about this during the course of my presentation, of course, I will be talking about this as well as the different trends available regarding innovative financing, the options available to Pakistan, and the ones that have been utilized. I will also be highlighting, most importantly, the debt sustainability, the importance of debt sustainability for Pakistan, the long-term planning that Pakistan has done in relation to debt sustainability, some of the possible risks available, risks being faced, the possible shocks, as well as the guidelines which we are following to try and bring a debt or make the debt more sustainable, and the steps taken so far. Towards the end, I'll talk about the innovative approaches that are basically around in the market and what are the measures that have been adopted. Next slide, please. Next slide. Sorry? I have to okay, but next slide. All right, ladies and gentlemen, this sets the overall context. This is basically an overview of Pakistan's profile. It's a big country. We have a population, we have a size of about 800 square kilometers. We have a population of around about 231 million. And of course, it's the fifth or the sixth largest country in the world. Strategically, we're an important country in terms of commerce and trade. We have a big youth population. Approximately more than 60% of our population is between the ages of 15 and 29. So that represents opportunities for Pakistan. Our debt to GDP ratio is 66%. Now, while not all debts are bad, of course, as long as the debt that you have, you can pay back, you can repay, and the purpose for which the debt is being used. For example, if you're using debt for financing payment of your salaries or budgetary support, then that can have negative consequences. But if you're using debt for, let's say, setting up projects or projects which are revenue generating, then that would be beneficial. Our external debt is approximately 37%, while the domestic debt constitutes approximately 63% of the total debt. Our domestic debt to GDP ratio in 2022 fell, whereas our external debt to GDP ratio rose. The average time of maturity to debts, which is an important indicator for domestic debts, around 4.2 years, whereas for external debts, around 7 years. Pakistan is one of the 10 most countries which is vulnerable to climate change, as was evidenced by the devastating floods that took place in 2022. While it contributes to less than 1% of the emissions around the world, yet it is amongst the 10 most countries which is exposed to climate change. The floods that took place in 2022 left behind a terrible tragedy. They caused a lot of devastation, and some of the indications of manifestation of devastation is given in the slide on the left-hand side under the flood shock. The estimated losses were to the tune of $30 billion, and the cost of restructuring was calculated to be about $16 billion. And most of the reconstruction was to be done in the transport and communication sector and housing sector. A large number of people died. Nearly 1/3 of the country was affected. 33 million people had to be displaced. Next slide, please. This lists the priorities and challenges being faced by Pakistan. The chart on the left-hand side gives an overview of Pakistan's debt situation. The government of Pakistan owes around about $85 billion to the rest of the world. Whereas when you include private sector debt and the amount of debt that the private sector companies owe to the international world, to the external agencies, then it comes to about $125 billion. But the obligation for the government is around about $85 million, including $6 billion, which government guarantees as debt. As far as macroeconomic stability is concerned, we have the twin deficit. The global inflation has also exacerbated the domestic inflation, which last year or in the current financial year was around 46%, and primarily being attributed to the food inflation. As far as debt sustainability is concerned, we have the means to repay our debt. It is not that we don't. Yes, our debt is high. The estimated debt payment needs are estimated about $19.1 billion, which we will pay in the next financial year. Financing needs arising out of the devastation caused for the floods, as I've informed, stand around $16 billion, primarily in the transport and communication sector. As far as, of course, when you talk about the financing, the integrated national financing framework, and when you try and align it with the Sustainable Development Agenda, which has to be achieved by 2030, approximately 16% of the GDP is required to be spent in order to achieve these SDG. Currently, we are spending around 5%. So 16% translates into around $46 billion per annum. We are very vulnerable to climate. In order to cope with the climate-induced disasters and resilience, to have a more climate-resilient infrastructure. Now, Pakistan is embarked on a process of reconstructing its infrastructure. But the important thing is that we are going for the need to build back better, need to have climate-resilient infrastructure. And for that itself, we need around $7 to $10 billion investment a year to ensure that whatever we do in terms of building climate resilience, or in terms of infrastructure, in terms of people's capacity to cope, we need around $7 to $10 billion a year. Next slide, please. All right, ladies and gentlemen, this talks about debt sustainability as far as the risks and shocks are concerned. The possible risks, the risks that Pakistan could be facing, or the shocks. When you have the GDP growth that we were able to achieve this year was only around 0.5%. primarily because of the floods and the devastation caused by the floods. This year, we are planning to achieve around about 3.5%. This is the latest figure that has been informed by the government of Pakistan. The higher the GDP growth, of course, there will be more financing needs. Now, when you have higher GDP growth, of course, it generates a lot of revenues, but if your revenues are not there, then there's greater reliance on debt. Global inflation was around 8.7% in 2022. In Pakistan, it was around 46%, and it is targeted to be around 36% in April 2023. It is, for this current financial year, it is targeted to be 21%. The government has made efforts and shall be making efforts in order to bring it down to around about 21%, which is still high, but better as compared to the 36 and 40% that we were having this year. Interest rates, globally, they were high. In the domestic interbank market, they stood around 22%. So that, again, increases the cost of construction, cost of investment, and that, while it is aimed at reducing inflation as well, but that may have the impact of reducing the growth rate. Other factors, global dynamics, conflicts in different parts of the world, which affects the food supply, food chains, monetary policies. There have been climate, well, I've just talked about the floods, market perception. If the country has a perception that it will not be able to, then it's difficult to raise debt from the international commercial markets. Then, of course, there's the overall situation also. But, of course, that is getting better in Pakistan. We've had stability for the last 1 year, and we hope to achieve more stability in order to ensure our path towards growth. Next slide, please. All right, this is, ladies and gentlemen, now in order to control debt, in order to ensure that our debt is sustainable, we draw our guidelines from the different laws and the frameworks that are available in Pakistan. One of them, of course, is the need to adhere to the stated benchmarks provided by the MTDMS. The MTDMS basically provides for targets for key risk indicators like the average time of maturity for debt, and of course the ratio between the domestic and the external debt in percentage terms. Naturally, it is important to increase revenues for ensuring fiscal discipline. You cut down your expenditure, increase revenues, so there's less reliance on debt. Lengthening the maturity profile of both domestic and external loans, we are trying to work in such a way so that there is no sudden or no spike in terms of the debt payment for a particular year, because that creates problem. We're trying to smooth out the debt repayment over the years. Diversification of instruments and investor base. The government of Pakistan has diversified the different instruments available as well as the tenors in order to increase for the different types of investors. Of course, these include the domestic loans, treasury bills, the Sukuk bonds, the Pakistan investment bonds, and for international loans, the different type of bonds like Sukuk and Euro bonds. Then we are of course focused on concessional external financing. Now, when you go to the international market for drawing loans, taking loans, our aim is to go for loans that are less expensive and have a longer tenure, primarily from the multilateral and the bilateral development banks. When you go for loans from the commercial banks, the commercial markets, then of course, or when you go for issuance of bonds, then they're on the higher side. So primarily, basically, the focus is on external concessional financing from multilateral development and bilateral development partners. We have a presence in international capital markets due on account of the different bonds that Pakistan has issued, like Sukuk bonds and Euro bonds. We are also developing our domestic debt and the debt market capacity in order to ensure that the domestic capital and the debt market are empowered enough or capable enough to purchase instruments issued for domestic market like the treasury bills, Sukuk bonds, and Pakistan investment bonds. We're also trying to facilitate investments by non-residents in government securities. We have a liquidity buffer. The government of Pakistan has not borrowed from the State Bank in the recent past in order to ensure that there's sufficient reserves available with the central bank, which is the State Bank of Pakistan, to give it to the commercial banks and for development purpose. Next slide, please. The steps that have been taken so far in terms of fiscal discipline, fiscal consolidation through revenue mobilization. The government is trying to enhance its tax base in order to ensure that the relevant tax sectors, sectors that have the ability to pay, are brought into the tax net in order to enhance revenues. Government has also made efforts to reduce expenditure so as to reduce the fiscal deficit and create more fiscal space for development purposes. The fiscal deficit was reduced by 4.6% of the GDP in the current financial year, which ends around June. The current account deficit was reduced from $17.4 billion to just $3.3 billion in the current financial year. That is an achievement for the government of Pakistan. There has been no borrowing from the State Bank of Pakistan. 3 billion rupees worth of domestic loans have been retired since 2019. So there have been some concrete steps taken. Almost 87% of external debt is long-term, which is good because we would like to have debt that is repayable over 25 to 30 years with a longer tenure and, of course, lesser interest rates. Diversification of domestic borrowing basket, ladies and gentlemen, I've already talked about. The government has diversified in terms of the type of instruments, type of debt instruments that are available in terms of the tenors, so available for the different types of investors. We are focusing on availing maximum concessional external finance. I've already talked about that. The government of Pakistan has taken steps to ease its debt repayment situation, such as rollovers of time and safe deposits that we have had that different countries have with us. That is, they're basically on a year-to-year basis, and they're extended on a year-to-year basis or 2 to 3 year basis. We have refinanced commercial loans in order to create some fiscal space for us. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is the last slide. This is the last slide, please. Next slide, please. All right. An overview of the innovative products and approaches available. These are the different types of approaches available, such as thematic bonds, the SDG bonds, sustainability-linked bonds, the KPI bonds, Sukuk bonds, green bonds are a local development organization, the local organization of the government of Pakistan, Water and Power Development Authority, which looks after dams and building reservoirs, experimented with green bonds worth $500 million to raise financial resources for its projects. The government of Pakistan has also tried the debt swaps for nature, for education and gender. We've had arrangements with 3 countries, with Canada, Germany, and Italy. With Canada, we had an debt swap arrangement of about 450 million Canadian dollars, primarily in the education sector. Same was the case with Germany in the education sector. Then we have blended financing instruments, including public-private partnerships and other modalities. We are also trying to enhance our debt management database in order to get an idea of, currently the debt management database was focusing on external debt, but we are now trying to bring all debts into our debt management base, including the local debt as well. We need to, of course, focus on fiscal resilience, disaster insurance, and risk financing, so that whenever there's a disaster, we're able to, in cooperation with regional groups, we're able to have a scheme whereby, in case there is such a disaster, the government of Pakistan is able to finance its reconstruction needs. So that is it as far as my presentation is concerned. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mayor. I think there are many countries in a similar situation as Pakistan. I think they will be keen to learn more from your approach to this, and it's certainly the case that many countries are really threatened by climate vulnerability, and that there is a great need to build back better. So now we want to turn to another angle on how thematic bonds can be a useful instrument for advancing gender equality. Gender equality has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and the climate crisis. And the World Economic Forum, in their Global Gender Gap report, they said that it will take over 130 years to eradicate the global gender gap, over 130 years. So given this context, IIX has launched the Orange Bond Initiative to tap into the US 100 trillion bond market, to place women at the forefront of capital markets as solutions to achieve the SDGs and build a more inclusive and climate resilient future for all. So Natasha, can you tell us about the initiative? How does the initiative address the SDG financing gap? And what do countries need to know to issue Orange Bond to bring in private capital? Over to you, Natasha.
Well, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be part of such an important discussion. Thank you for hosting me. And the reason I'm not there is because I'm actually working on the next Orange Bond. So forgive me for not joining all of you in person, but hopefully we'll meet some of you very soon. I'm not sure if you can see my screen. Can you, Anna Maria? Is it sharing or? Okay,
No,
perfect.
not yet.
All right. What about now?
We're still waiting. Now it works.
Oh, perfect, perfect. So I just wanted to start with some context. Why are we talking about gender in the grand scheme of things? And I think, if you go back to Greek mythology, there were two gods of war. There was Athena and Ares, and Athena always fought with wisdom, and Ares fought more focused on violence and bloodshed. And I do think that balance of gender equality is very important in financial markets, and we've been missing it for centuries. However, when you look very closely at risk, return, and impact, you see a very strong positive influence that gender equality can bring. And I'm not just saying having women, but I'm really saying making sure that women and men both have a seat and a voice at the table and are equally important. In terms of mitigating risk, we are in an area where for the first time, unfortunately, in many decades, we are seeing a decline in peace and security on the one hand. And while women are not the main combatants of the wars we are seeing in Europe and the Middle East and in any unrest in parts of Asia, they are very often the main victims. But at the same time, if you have women at the table, peace agreements last 35% longer. In terms of managing returns, we are seeing incredible amount of statistics on how companies and boards that have gender diversity tend to be 26%, up to 26% more profitable. We know when we think about GDP, women were 1.8 times more likely to drop out of the workforce during the COVID-19 pandemic. However, if you reintegrate them by 2030, maybe we can cut off some of the 130 years we were talking about, and we can actually add $13 trillion to global GDP if women were equally a part of the workforce. And I think that is critical because it also addresses a huge part of the SDG financing gap. And last but not least, there's so much talk about climate. And I think, for instance, you heard from our panelists from Indonesia and the incredible leadership we're seeing from Indonesia and many other countries in Asia tackling the climate crisis. But we are not going to be able to transition to a net zero economy. We're not going to be able to adapt if half of the population is not part of the solution. And so I do think there's a very strong case also for having women. We did a regression analysis through the Orange Bond Initiative, and we see that the Climate Adaptation Index and the Gender Equality Index are actually very strongly positively correlated. So I'll talk about some of these things during the presentation, but this isn't really just a nice thing to do. It is really the smart thing to do if you're thinking about financial markets and having a gender lens. And so this really gave birth to the Orange Bond Initiative. And it's called Orange Bonds, which is very apt for this event because it is based on the color of SDG 5, gender equality, which is an orange hue. The mission of the initiative is to mobilize $10 billion by 2030 to advance gender equality worldwide. Big focus on low-income groups, low-income countries, and the goal is to empower at least 100 million women and girls, if not more. There's a set of guiding principles that was out, which is very nicely harmonized with the Green Bond principles, and I'll talk about that in a moment. It is designed to really go beyond just setting standards, which I know is tradition, but also to focus a lot on mobilizing capital, and I'll talk about an actual transaction in a moment. And it also focuses on ecosystem building, and we have done some market intelligence reports, which I can touch on later in the discussion if there's time. A big part of the movement, which we're very, very proud of, is, I was on the advisory council for the green and social bonds for a number of years, and very often was there's decent amount of gender diversity, but not very strong representation from the global south. I don't think I saw anyone from Africa or Latin America. I was very often the only Asian in the room, and all of that really has to change. The Orange Bond Initiative has 73,000 signatories globally from all 6 continents and very, very strong representation from the global south, which we are incredibly proud of. Indonesia, Pakistan, we have signatories from your countries as well, so very proud of that. We have joined forces on the steering committee, IEX, with Australian DFAT, the United States Development Finance Corporation on the public sector side, but also a number of private sector players like Nuveen, one of the largest sustainable debt investors in the world, Sherman & Sterling, ANZ Bank, And from civil society angle, we have water.org and we have UNCDF on our advisory council. So it is truly representative of a very diverse group coming with very diverse perspectives on how do you actually have a human rights lens also when you think about investments. Now, one of the things I want you to leave you with is it is interesting that I know there's a great interest in green and social bonds, but last year markets were tough. We're hearing that from all the other panelists. And unfortunately, at least in the last 10 years that I've been actively doing this, I come from a Wall Street background, green and social bonds actually dropped by about 90% globally. A lot of this was because of the greenwashing fines. A lot of this was also because of global economy crashing, but interest in gender actually doubled last year. And the Orange Bond Initiative has been pushing very hard for that because we're making the case that this, again, isn't just a nice thing to do. It actually helps you stabilize your returns and reduce your risk. Now, orange bonds, as I said, can be viewed as a cross-cutting asset class. And I think this is very important. Traditionally, you would think of gender just as a social issue. But as I've mentioned, we really see a very, very strong case for multiple SDGs. In our orange bond that we did last year, we actually hit about 12 SDGs. And we are, in fact, one of the only orange bonds in the world, as you'll see on this slide, which actually has a climate lens. And I think this is very important. We are competing with other pure gender bonds on the market. One of the ways that IX's transaction, which was the first orange bond to come to the market last year, also brings a unique factor, is that we actually have a part of our proceeds which are earmarked for green. We actually have our partners at SIDA. So, again, thank you very much to Anna Maria and her team for being a very important partner who actually supported us to be able to bring in that climate lens, which was not as strong before. Besides SIDA, we also had the United States DFC, and together, I think there's a very important role, and I think we, hopefully we get time to discuss this, that various governments can also play, making sure that these issuances focus on additionality. They're really investing in places where the traditional private sector will not go without some sort of de-risking support from additional governments. So SIDA and DFC actually partnered last year to guarantee our bonds with a partial guarantee, which was instrumental in us bringing in private sector investors from across the world who would not otherwise directly invest directly in these SMEs across Asia and Africa. In the interest of time, I think I'll pause here. Hopefully we get to go more into this, but there are many market concerns, and I can share some of these hopefully later in the discussion, but I'll try to keep us on time for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. And I think one of the interesting aspects with the Orange Bond is the close follow-up on results achieved and the impact on women. And I think that is something that could be showcased also for other investors. So we'll get back on a second round of questions, and I will ask you to be quite brief. I know we are running short of time. We started late after lunch also. And I would like to also open up for a few questions from the audience. So think about what questions you want to address the panel with. So Indonesia launched the Integrated National Financing Framework on the sidelines of the third G20 Development Working Group. Their meeting in August last year during the country's G20 presidency. The government is actively trying to diverse its financing strategy using the INFF approach and mobilizing and unlocking capital from a range of sources to accelerate investment in national priorities. So how does the INFF support thematic bond issuance, would you say?
Okay, thank you, Anna. I think previous speaker has also mentioned that in order to achieve SDGs and also climate change adaptation effort, financing is the key main driver. And then in Indonesian case, at least we need around 4.7 trillion US dollar to achieve the SDGs target by 2030. On top of that, for the climate mitigation, we still need additional 300 billion US dollars. And to fill the financing gap, Indonesia, same as other countries, we recognize the opportunity and urgency to leveraging innovative financing instruments to accelerate Indonesia transitions to a low carbon energy and sustainable development path. And when you mentioned about the launching of our INFF last year, at the time the Minister of National Development Planning emphasized that actually Indonesia has tools and resources to achieve our SDG commitment, but the challenge is how to bringing all stakeholders together to align their business and visions with the SDGs. And I think this is the role of INFF to strengthen the planning process and overcome existing obstacles to financing sustainable development goals. And INFF as well can help countries like Indonesia to identify new instruments for financings. And in the morning sessions, our colleague from the UNDP, from the Bappenas, Indonesian Planning Agency, also mentioned that with INFF, we can identify the government potential contributions and align it within the comprehensive integrated national strategy. So therefore, within the INFF frameworks, the issuance of thematic bonds such as Green Sukuk, SDG bond, and SDG blue bonds recognized by all stakeholders as one of financing instrument options toward a low carbon economy and sustainable development path. This is quite important in order to get the commitment from the line ministries during and after the issuance of thematic bonds. And we also want to share to you that unlike the advanced countries, in developing countries like Indonesia, actually the public sectors become the pioneers in developing innovative instruments. Then, after the public sector see our success story, then the public sector will follow our path. So we expect that by issuing our thematic bonds, it will increase supply from the private sectors, and also with having a credible INFF, we can also increase the demand side by inviting or attracting more investor to financing our development strategy. I will stop there.
Thank you so much for being quite brief. Mindful of the time, I will move to you, Vachareen, one more time. Debt to GDP ratio in developing Asia-Pacific economies increased, notably between 2008 and 2021, due to the considerable sovereign debt buildup since the global financial crisis and further debt surging during the COVID-19 pandemic. So how can countries manage debt risk without sacrificing development? And how could INFF help countries manage the debt distress and better align debt management policies with development objectives?
Right, thank you. So when we talk about reducing debt risk or fiscal risk, I think the most common, the first thing that people think about is fiscal consolidation, which is also Mr. Karim, a speaker from Pakistan, also mentioned. But just like if you think about a household in which high debt, there are many ways out. First is to get your children out of school. The second is to buy less food. All of this help to improve the household financial situation. But it is whether, in the same analogy, which is what the country would like to do or not. In many cases, fiscal consolidation means a steep cut in the social protection spending, environmental spending. All these have a long-term development impact of a country, potential output, and also human loss in the long run. So in many ways, a country has many options. The first, also highlighted in other sessions as well, is to increase the tax revenue. Okay, estimates suggest that the tax gap in the Asia-Pacific is still quite wide. Okay, which means that the tax potential is far exceed the actual tax collection. This could be due to a large informal economy or inefficient tax administration. Another way is to increase the spending effectiveness and efficiency. which also talk about in other session, about the project oversight, how you introduce the modern technology to increase this efficiency of the project, and also in the selection as well. Another part is on the third part is on the public debt management. So data suggests that the region as a whole, we are not doing that good, and actually there are many countries in which the quality of the public debt management has declined in the last decade. On the good side, many countries now have a timely reporting of the public debt data. They know the composition, how much is domestic debt, how much is external debt, and more countries have a dedicated public debt management offices. But on the lagging area, okay, for many countries in the region, if you want to know the latest government borrowing contracts, term and condition, where they are borrowing from, at which interest rate, what is the maturity period of that. For many countries, this information seems to be absent. And another part which also highlight is information on the contingent liability. Okay, if a natural disaster hit tomorrow, how much would it cost in terms of fiscal cost? These estimates are very rare in the region as a whole. But what I mentioned so far is in a country which you are in a relatively good shape, okay, default is not coming soon, because all this revenue collection, spending efficiency, public debt management take at least a few years to materialize. But for the country in which are in a deeper trouble, I mean high risk distress is coming in the next few months. I think in this case there's a bigger role for the international community to do. For example, the G20 common framework still not allowing middle income country, regardless of how bad the situation is, to be part of this debt relief initiative. And for the region, Asia-Pacific, we see that the emergence of the unconventional creditor, in particular China as an official creditor, and also the bondholder, private creditor. The share of this unconventional creditor has increased a lot in the past decade. The implication is that once the country needs to negotiate the debt resolution, it's harder for them to do, okay? Because there are many stakeholders, and there's no streamlined common framework. Basically, we don't know how to do it. So basically, this has been done on a case by case, which is time consuming, and in contrast to the urgent nature of the debt resolution. I think that's pretty much it.
Thank you, Vacherin. I will move directly to Humair because Pakistan is considering to establish an INFF and to develop a national financing strategy, which will have a strong crisis lens, as I understand, and covering crisis prevention, resilience building, and crisis response. Can you tell us why you think it's important to have a well-tailored INFF for Pakistan?
Well, certainly, I think it's INF is extremely crucial for Pakistan. There's no doubt about that. The government of Pakistan is in the process of developing. There's been a lot of work going on. It's in the process of developing an official integrated national financing framework meant to be for achieving the sustainable development goals. Now, in addition to this, before I talk further about the INF in Pakistan, the government of Pakistan, for achieving the SDGs required to be achieved by 2030, it has put in a certain institutional framework as well. Its national development goals have been aligned with the sustainable development goal envisioned through a national long-term vision 2025. Over the last few years, of course, over the last 2-3 years, the progress has not been much, but in the last year, there's been renewed attempts to move Pakistan in such a way that the national vision of 2025 is achieved, which would help in achieving the 2030 sustainable goals. There's no doubt about the fact that the INF is extremely important. It's a crucial step towards sustainable financing because it integrates domestic and international resources for long-term development. It aligns the strategic investments with national goals, fostering resilience and creativity in the national economic landscape. That is important when I talk about resilience. It's very important, especially in the face of the climate-related threats that we are facing. We have also moved in collaboration with the United Nations Development Programme. We've also moved from a short-term crisis response or ad hoc response to adopt and move towards a more long-term perspective for sustainable financing. So by integrating these various financial resources and prioritizing investments aligned with national development goals, Pakistan can address its debt stress while building a more sustainable future. So it's, the importance for Pakistan, the importance of INF Pakistan can't be, it can't be emphasized more. I think it's very important. It's, of course, then there's also the role of the private financing and foreign investments. The emphasizing private financing and foreign investments, again, for Pakistan is very important because of the scarcity of the local private finance and the limited access to private international finance. By attracting greater private sector participation and international investments, international funding, Pakistan can address its resource constraints in order to achieve sustainable growth leading towards the achievement of the sustainable development goals. Now, probably you're aware, of course, it's an agreed thing that it's not one size, INFF is not a one-size-fits-all approach. There have to be certain amendments made. It has basically 4 principal building blocks: the assessment and diagnostic component, the financing strategy, the monitoring and governance. And each building block is crucial in developing the national capacity for strategic planning and managing sustainable development. So for each country, it'll be different. There's an iterative process of designing and implementing activities within these building blocks, which reinforces the progress and synergy between them. So it's not exactly that you'll have one INFF framework which should be suitable for all countries. It has to be implemented with certain amendments. This framework will, of course, integrate domestic and external financing resources, align it with our development goals, and it will help streamline the financing process for the sustainable development goals. Of course, there are other models other measures that we have also, which have always been there: the public sector development program, the provincial annual development programs, the medium-term budgetary framework. But this integrated national financing framework would put things in better perspective and align your resources, integrate your resources, align them with the sustainable development goals. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Umar. We are now moving back to Natasha, who is joining us digitally from Singapore. And for the Orange Bond initiative to succeed, there is the need to bring multiple ecosystem actors together to collectively strengthen the Orange Bond ecosystem. So you have conducted a market survey to understand the main concerns of the market players and how to address them. Can you please share your findings, and what is your advice to the ecosystem actors on how to strengthen the Orange Bond infrastructure? Over to you, Natasha.
Great question. Thank you very much. IX did indeed work on an insights paper on behalf of the Orange Bond Initiative. This was done with the support of the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and was published, I believe, around Women's Day this year. So it's a very recent survey. There was a number of concerns that the market has from sustainable bond issuances. I'll touch on the biggest one in the interest of time, which was the rising concerns around greenwashing and impact washing. And so we really wanted to take a very critical look at how orange bonds can build a more gender responsive financial system where gender is more embedded in the DNA of how you think through an orange investment, if you will. Orange bonds are therefore the only asset class from all the sustainable debt issuances that mandates what's called an impact confirmation, which means you have to directly interview and discuss impact with a sample size of the women or female beneficiaries on what the problems are on the ground. And the whole idea is to build more transparency. We understand this is very complex complex ecosystems we're working in. There are many issues when you fund entities with the best intentions. There are many things that can go wrong, and it is not an easy thing to do. But I think we owe it to ourselves, and this gives us maybe in many ways an edge over the green bonds, is that it's very hard to go and do a climate measurement. You'll have to, have an external party. With an orange bond, you actually have a stakeholder group who is supposed to be benefiting. And so it really mandates you to collect data directly from them. And that actually gives you a plethora of other SDG data, their access to water and sanitation, clean energy resources, how climate adaptive are they going to be, for instance. And I think last year, for instance, with our orange bond, we had about 1,800 entities who were approached and applying, and only 10 we went forward with, because we're constantly dropping out entities where the women don't confirm impact. So not only are we selecting the best in class, but then we go on to make sure that we are pushing them to develop very strong gender action plans. So as much as we can, even from among the best in class, there's more transparency. We collected about 16,000 impact data points last year before we did the issuance. So we're constantly using that to balance risk, return, and impact. I think there's no way to achieve the SDGs without more data, and data that is correlated with things like risk and return. So you're making informed decisions because we are looking to create that additionality through the investments, especially since we have public sector partners and capital involved. I think one of the big opportunities, I'll build on what some of the other speakers have touched on, is really to integrate an orange lens into these integrated national financing frameworks, especially for governments that are recognizing that women tend to be an untapped part of or an undertapped part of the economy. There's so much research on the benefits of having a gender lens. So in fact, we worked with the Malaysian government on their 2015 to 25-year social finance strategy, which led to the development of multiple social initiatives. We've also worked with a number of UN agencies. We have the USDFC and the Australian DFAT on our Orange Bond initiative. And so I think we would be delighted to work more with more countries in Asia to also think through if we could do an orange lens in the integrated national financing framework to design sovereign orange bonds, which could blend with the green and blue bonds. So for instance, even with Indonesia, I was blown away by the first speaker, just the incredible leadership you've shown in the region. But we'd love to look at some of your green and blue bonds and see if we can integrate an orange lens so women start taking more ownership and being part of the solution, so we can all accelerate this together more effectively. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. And I had an opportunity 2 weeks ago to visit Cambodia and the financial institution that provides microfinance to women, funding that comes from the Orange Bond. And it was quite interesting to hear how IIX is actually working with the lending company to make sure that they really produce what they're supposed to, and how they are working on interacting with women. So now it's the time for questions from the floor. So I think we could take a maximum of 3 questions. So I have one gentleman down there, and one on the table here. That's 2. Anyone else? So then I think we start with the 2 questions. So let's start. Yeah, we can start there. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Shiran Fernando. I'm Chief Economist at the Ceylon Chamber in Sri Lanka. My question is to Vacharan. I think the thesis is on spending for a lot of these economies, or spending on SDG and spending right, and not think too much about the DSA in that perspective. But for economies that are probably restructuring or in the precipice or defaulted and going the next step, what is kind of the recipe towards this thesis of what you just explained? Is it purely just not spending, not cutting down on the spending towards social spending, or is it raising more revenue that gets redirected? What's the thinking on that? And to a speaker from Indonesia, Denny, I think you mentioned a little bit about the pricing benefit. Could you elaborate what you meant by that in terms of, is that pricing benefit of some of these bonds so that it kind of feeds into better dividends for investors or for the overall projects that some of these are trying to get through?
I think we'll take the questions first, and then I'll give you the word. So please.
Thank you. My question is for Natasha. Natasha, an inspiring presentation, really. I have a couple of questions on the orange bonds. Typically, what have been your observations around the kind of projects or products for which the bonds are structured? What's the trend? What's the mainstream trend? And then related to that, who are the typical investors for an orange bond? Where is this most popularly pursued in the private sector?
Thank you. I'm looking around to see if there is a third question. If not, maybe we'll start with you, Natasha, first, and we take the other round. And,
Yes,
and you may
certainly.
also reflect on the other panelists if you want. So you will each get 1 minute.
Yes, perfect. I will do that. Thank you. And that's a great question, and I'm glad you enjoyed the presentation. I think it is an important time in our history to see how much of that 130 years for gender equality we can collectively knock off. And I think in terms of what gets invested in, I'll give you, as opposed to talking broadly about what it could do, because in our opinion, gender can be woven in, like I said, into a green bond, a blue bond, or a social bond. And we have seen cases of that happening. I'll tell you about the orange bond we did, so it's more concrete. The kind of entities we were investing in were sort of in the missing middle. They were too big for, say, pure development grant funding. They are too small for, say, the IFC or traditional banks to typically lend to, or even if they would lend to them, it would not be on terms that would essentially allow them the time and the space to build on their gender and climate lens. So we were really looking for those kind of entities. Like I said, if you have government capital involved, this is a blended finance product. We had the Swedish and the US governments involved. You have to be very strategic about how you want to use that capital and make sure you're really attracting capital for entities that could not otherwise get that capital. So that's called additionality. And so the kind of entities we were investing in were sort of tier 2 microfinance, sort of in the middle range. We were looking at a lot of clean energy products. We had an electric vehicle provider that was putting women in the green workforce. We had lots of sustainable agriculture entities. Women grow most of the world's food that we eat. And we had a lot of water and sanitation products because climate stress first falls on the women. And we saw very strong positive impact from entities that were giving women access to climate and sanitation loans, both in terms of COVID recovery, but also in terms of climate responsiveness. So that was the kind of entities, the SMEs doing very deep impact work, which tend to be a little bit off the radar screen or aren't always getting capital on the terms that they need them to grow with an impact lens. The other question in terms of investors, and I think this is again going back to if you have government capital, you want additionality, as I just said, but you also want leverage. If they're in there to de-risk your instruments, you have to be getting private sector capital. So we had, about, I would say, over a dozen investors from across the world. Over our series, over the last, since 2017, we've had investors, trillion-dollar asset managers like Nuveen from the United States. We've had super funds from the Pacific, Australia, New Zealand come in. We've had microfinance investment vehicles like Symbiotics and Blue Orchard from Europe. And we've had a number of family offices from countries in Asia, Indonesia, in fact, but also Singapore, Hong Kong, who have come in and who want to be a part of the solution, but have not seen a gender product in the market. So it's been brilliant to see so many different types of investors from all across the world coming in to buy orange bonds, which is a very positive sign for us, especially last year when the market dipped and our bond was fully subscribed. I think it's a strong sign that gender equality in orange bonds is an asset class that is here to stay. Thank you for the question. Should I do my reflections on others now, Anna Maria, or should I wait for the end?
I think you have spent your 1 minute, unless you have a very quick thing you want to mention.
I think I'll just say, like I mentioned, Indonesia and Pakistan, you're both there. We'd love to work with you on doing more orange, blending more orange into your existing initiatives, because I think both of you mentioned some very powerful things, and we'd love to work together to bring this to the ecosystem. We, of course, have Sweden and the United States and Australia we work with, but we'd love to work with local governments as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. So over to you, Humair. I think we would take the round of the opposite that we had before. I think no, Humair. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. And I think there was one question, which obviously the questions were addressed to the panelists here, but there was some mention about the gentleman over there. He was talking about restructuring and the need for creating fiscal space. Now, the objective, obviously, of course, is to enhance fiscal space so that you have some room for development. It's not just about reducing expenditure. At the same time, it is, of course, you have to rationalize your expenditure. The government expenditure has to be rationalized. The revenues have to be increased. You have to also initiate a process of reforms, which the government of Pakistan has initiated. For example, getting rid of subsidies that were being given to different sections of society and which were not warranted. So the government is working on a package, has taken a number of initiatives whereby the subsidies should only go to the poor and the people who need it, not to other sectors. Otherwise, they would just be, because subsidies are basically an inefficiency in the economy, and they should only be undertaken when you have to support the downtrodden sectors of the society, the poor people, the people who actually need it. And of course, as part of controlling the expenditure, there have been other reforms being undertaken, the reform of the state-owned enterprise also. Those are important reforms because they had become, there's a huge number of people over there. The size had become bigger, so their operations needed to be streamlined. So measures are being taken in that, of course, and there are other reforms also in the taking place in the energy sector, which would focus, which would result in saving expenditure and have a greater fiscal space. Right? Thank you.
Thank you, Humair. Sorry, Vacheria. I just wanted to give everyone a minute towards the end.
Just in response to the question and colleague from Sri Lanka on what explained the convergence of the public debt in our pilot case study of Mongolia. Okay, so basically the answer is it's a combination of a policy package. Okay, one step back is that this analysis was done as part of the macro modeling, okay, and analysis. And our assumption is that according to the block of this approach, the first one, we took the SDG costing from UNDP, which is goal by goal. Okay, and we group that into which part should be a public spending, which part should be public spending, and how much is that. This is the first one. The second one is the what we call a structural development policy. Okay, which in this Mongolia case, we assume toward a more diversified and greener economy. Okay, more diversified mean we assume that the educational spending increased to build a more productive workforce. That Mongolia engaged with some potential free trade agreement based on the literature review. On the greener economy, we assume that the country introduced the carbon tax, reduced the fuel subsidy, and engaging spending more on biodiversity laws and all of that. And the last part is on the national SDG financing. This covers both to enhance the public finance and also to increase the contribution by the private finance for the sustainable development. For example, in the public finance, we took a study from UNDP that if Mongolia engaged in a debt swap, how much fiscal saving it could have. Okay, and on the increasing the private finance, we look at the threshold. PPP, public-private partnership, on average, let's say in the energy sector, in the region, private sector contribute about 30% of GDP. If Mongolia is 20%, we increased that by 10 percentage point. So in a sense, it's a combination of a policy package based on the literature review specific to Mongolia.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question regarding the pricing benefit. So as I mentioned earlier that when we issue thematic bonds, it requires a lot of effort from the preparing the frameworks, and then the framework goes through the review by SPO, and then when we get the proceed, we need to make sure that the proceed is allocated into the eligible projects, and every year we issue allocations and impact report. and it also need to be audited by international auditing firm. So it's not easy and it's not cheap as well. So that's why as issuer, we expect that investor will appreciate our effort by asking lower yield, meaning that lower cost of fund from us as issuers. But so far, we haven't seen any significant pricing benefit, or we call it green premium or greenium. We haven't seen any significant greenium when we issue thematic bond. For example, in 2021, when issue SDG bonds, yes, the yield is issued, the bonds issued with zero new issuance premium or new NIC, new issuance concessions. As you know, when we issue bonds, usually investors were asking some premium above the market yield. But when we issue SDG bonds, the new issuance concession or new issuance premium is zero. But the question is, the zero NIC because of the SDG bonds as the label, or because of the market condition that at the time is quite conducive. So that's something that still debatable. So what we are trying to say here is, with a lot of effort, a lot of expenses that we need to issue before the issuance, we expect that investor willing to appreciate us to give the greenium or pricing benefits in order to attract more issuers to also issue SDG bonds or others instruments that related to the SDGs objective.
Thank you so much. And I think this has been a really interesting panel showing how integrated national financing frameworks are very useful for planning ahead. Indonesia has used this, has been one of the forerunners, and Pakistan is now about to enter into this. And I think there are quite a number of countries in Asia using this already today. And aligning that with different new innovative financing instruments, and really seeing also the fact that the indebtedness ratio is not, you need to link that to what you are actually investing in, and long-term investment in SDGs can actually be very good, even if you are highly indebted. But the INFF could help you in assessing this. So, so well-architectured SDG bonds can be very instrumental to both align countries' budgets with SDGs and climate goals and disease. So cautiously structured SDGs can be a game changer for our common sustainability future. So we really need to get into the working mood and continue to develop more innovative instruments. So thank you so much to a very insightful panel. A great applause to them.